Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March 18th, 2025, and our friend Professor Marandi is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me again, Nima.
Let's get started with what we've learned last night about that Israelis, again, they're attacking Gaza and what has happened to ceasefire and why they have decided to go with attacking on Gazans while we know that the prisoners have not been exchanged totally.
I think we have discussed this previously, and I never believed that this ceasefire was going to last. And I think it's been obvious for the past months that that was not the intention of the Israelis. On average, over more than 3 Palestinians were being murdered per day in the Gaza Strip during this period, and in Lebanon. Uh, on average, one Lebanese citizen has been murdered by the Israelis every day. And Western media, Western governments, the guarantors of the ceasefires, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, none of them did anything. They allowed the regime to violate both ceasefires, both through murdering people, but also in the case of Gaza, we know that now they don't even let any food, or I think it's been 16 days now that they haven't allowed food to get in, water to get in, medical supplies to get in. There's a starvation siege going on, and complete silence in the West. Complete silence. So I don't believe that that was the intention. It was clear that all these murders were going to lead us to a dead end. And last night, the Israelis carried out one of the most uh, vicious atrocities during this whole year and a half, slaughtering well over 400 people until an hour ago or half an hour ago, well over 400 people. God knows how many people will be martyred in the coming hours. And this is partially because Netanyahu has his own internal problems with Shin Bet, the divisions in Israeli society, his future status as prime minister, his legal issues. So when everything depends on internal regime politics, then obviously there's not going to be any hope for Palestinians to be able to sleep uh, with peace and security at nights. And the same is true for Lebanon. The same is true for any part of the region that wants to remain independent, wants to resist Zionism. And of course, the betrayal of the Palestinian people is really astounding. Uh, Arab countries in the region have actually assisted the United States in bombing Yemen. Why? Because Yemen restarted its siege of the Red Sea. Remember, when the ceasefire began in Gaza, Ansarullah, the Yemeni armed forces, or what the West likes to call the Houthis, it's a sort of slur, by the way. I know many people who like Ansarullah use the term because it's used so widely, but they use it as a slur. Ansarullah is much more than the Houthis, but it is a national, and now its popularity goes far beyond the borders of Yemen. But Ansarullah halted the uh, siege on the Zionist regime after the ceasefire. And only after the starvation siege began did it give a warning. When that warning went unheeded, then a few days ago they restarted the siege against the Israeli regime to force it to allow food and medicine to get into Gaza. So then the Americans and the British bombed them so that the Israeli regime could use the Red Sea. And Qatar, the Emirates, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, all of them facilitated these airstrikes, whether through refueling, whether through using their base, Americans being able to use their bases or using their airspace. They were all complicit in this. So when you see, for example, Al Jazeera shedding tears for the people of Gaza, the people who pay for Al Jazeera, the owners who own Al Jazeera, they're helping the Americans bomb Yemen in order for Yemen to stop the siege, to make it easier for the Israeli regime to continue with the genocidal siege. This is the state of affairs. Or even now, as we speak, Erdogan continues to provide the regime with inexpensive oil from Baku. And we just saw yesterday that the Baku regime signed a gas agreement with the Israeli regime where they will help explore Palestine, occupied Palestine in the waters in the Mediterranean for gas reserves and to develop a gas production. This is where things stand. So as you know, it is very difficult. It is a very difficult situation, but the resistance will continue. Yemen will continue to block the Red Sea. They will be undeterred. And of course, the United States is now, as we all know, threatening Iran, but Iran is not going to be deterred. It will continue to support the axis of resistance, whether in Yemen, whether in Lebanon, whether in Palestine or elsewhere. That policy will continue. The United States also, I think, probably, I'm guessing, that the reason why Trump gave the green light was because of pressure from the Zionist lobby at home, but also I think he has other reasons to motivate him. One is that, as expected, the ceasefire talks and the negotiations over Ukraine are not going as well as planned, and the Russians are not going to just simply accept a ceasefire under terms that are in conflict or that do not abide by the terms that the Russians themselves or that are not compatible with the terms that the Russians themselves declared months ago or last year. So Trump has so far no success in Ukraine. Ultimately, Ukraine is going to be seen as a failure for Trump. Western media is going to depict him as the person who loses Ukraine. And I think that he wants to show himself to be strong and powerful. And just like when he speaks of Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal and so on, I think that the crimes that he's committing in Yemen are partially to distract attention away from that, but also, as I said, under pressure from the Zionist lobby and in order to help the Israeli regime.
What does the new administration have that makes it different from the Biden administration? Because the way that Donald Trump is talking, it seems that he has a new solution to fight Houthi, to fight Ansarullah and Yemenis. And do you think that the new administration, is that part of a campaign to put pressure on Iran? Or because the way he was mentioning that Iran is behind what the Yemenis and Ansarullah are doing, and the fact that he's simply ignoring the sovereignty of Yemen and saying that Iran is ordering them to do that, does it have anything to do with the reality?
That is an important point as well. The Americans, the Europeans, their think tanks, they use particular language to frame things because they're completely biased. All the think tanks in the United States, the media, they're linked to money, and they're funded by they're linked to big money, and they're funded by major corporations and entities which are a part of the establishment, that they comprise the establishment in the United States. So these so-called experts, these analysts, and of course these pundits, they frame things in a particular way, in a way in which uh, endorses and supports the dominant narrative of Western regimes on Iran and the region. So Ansarullah, they are the Houthis. Ansarullah is a proxy. Hezbollah is a proxy. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are proxies. Why? Because they want to say that they have no agency, that they are just mercenaries, and that the Iranians pulled the strings, which is nonsense. And it means to diminish their importance. It means to say that they're not really important. They're just being fed money, and if there's no money, then they will collapse. Well, when Trump was president during his previous term in office, he imposed the maximum pressure sanctions. He said he has destroyed the Iranian economy, but the resistance continued to exist and grow, including in Yemen. So if it's all about money, then those 4 years prove that his logic and the logic of Western think tanks and Western elites is deeply flawed. The fact is that in the case of Yemen, they've been surrounded by the Americans, and genocide has been imposed upon them for a decade. The genocide in Gaza is extraordinarily painful to see. Watching the scenes are horrific, but we've had the same thing going on in Yemen for years, for 7 years or so. The Saudis, with they spent hundreds of billions of dollars destroying Yemen, and so did the Emiratis. But they failed. They failed to take the capital. And Ansarullah controls, or 80% of the population of Yemen lives in areas controlled by Ansarullah and the Yemeni government, the government in Sana'a, the capital. Why is that the case? It's because they have popular legitimacy. If they didn't have popular legitimacy, all those mercenary armies that the Saudis and the Emiratis paid for, all of those airstrikes that took place day and night, the Saudi and Emirati airstrikes, and especially the Saudi airstrikes, were much worse than the American and Israeli and British airstrikes, because they were carried out 24 hours a day, every day, for years. But they failed. Why? Because Ansarullah has popular legitimacy. But the Americans don't want people to know this. The Europeans don't want people to know this. BBC, CNN, the New York Times, Breitbart, no one wants, Fox News, no one wants people to know the truth. They just want them to be seen as proxies of the Iranian regime, and Ansarullah in particular is the Houthi proxy of the Iranian regime. So when they look at it from that perspective, yes, they can be easily undermined and defeated. But the fact is that when the genocidal war that the Saudis and the Emiratis were carried out, when it came to an end, when a ceasefire was established, it was because Ansarullah was winning the war. Their missile defense capabilities and their offensive capabilities, missile offense and drone capabilities increased so much that they began to destroy Saudi oil installations and production capabilities. And even today, it is believed that the Saudis have not been able to restore their capacity to what it was before. It's no longer that much of a swing state, as they call it, because of the damage that Ansarullah did to their installations. And as a result, the Saudis accepted a ceasefire. So this shows that Trump is, and the Western media uh, their claims that they can defeat Ansarullah are nonsense. Trump has no new weapon or no new capability up his sleeve that did not exist 2 months ago. If it had existed under Biden, they would have used it. They would have done it. Biden was regularly bombing Yemen, and one of the airstrikes that one of the series of airstrikes that the Americans carried out under Biden was much more severe than the strikes that Trump carried out. And they're not doing any real damage, because we have to keep in mind that Yemen has been building underground facilities for a decade, because they've been being bombed for a decade. 7 years by the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then by Biden and the British regime, and now again by Trump. So what they are doing, according to my friends in Yemen, is that in many cases, they're bombing the places that they bombed before, and they are bombing civilian targets. And we've seen images of children being slaughtered. But of course, the Western media, they're not going to show it. They're going to mimic or repeat the Western narrative, just like what we're seeing in Gaza. Just like you will see the reality in on online here and there, even though it's being suppressed, but you won't see the reality in the Western media. So he does not have any new capabilities, just like the Israeli regime doesn't. Right now, the Israelis are saying that we're going to hit Hamas in a way in which they've never been hit before. Well, that's what they've been saying for the last year and a half, that they're finished. From day one, they said it's going to be over, and this is the end of it. Remember, there are no innocents in Gaza, and they're going. Back then, they were saying they were going to wipe out Hamas and its allies, but they couldn't. So all they're going to do is slaughter more people. As I said, in the case of Netanyahu, it's because of his own internal problems. His cabinet, the head of Shin Bet, which he wants to remove, because he's pursuing cases that could bring down Netanyahu or embarrass him more than before. And he wants to strengthen his cabinet. So in Israel, if you want to stay in power, you have to kill more people. That's how Israeli society is. And in the case of Trump, as I said, he's abiding by the demands of the lobby. But also, I think he has his own problems. He wants to distract attention away from his lack of success elsewhere. And I should add, probably just as important as anything else, is that all of this is also linked to an attempt to intimidate Iran. The United States wants Iran to end its support for the resistance, for the Palestinians in particular, because remember, Hezbollah and Ansarullah, they are fighting to help the people of Palestine. Their sacrifices, while everyone else is betraying the Palestinian people, their sacrifices, their martyrs, have been for the sake of Gaza, for the sake of the Palestinian people. So what the Americans want is for the Iranians to distance themselves from Palestine, the Palestinian cause, to be like Turkey, just to give lip service, to pretend that the Turkish government, not the Turkish people, but to give lip service, like the Al Jazeera, to give lip service, or Qatar, or Egypt, or whoever. They would find that as more than acceptable. That would be, I think that would lead to a very different situation. But the point is that how can Iranians accept the massacre and the extermination of the Palestinian people? It's not going to happen. And the Iranians will continue to support the axis of resistance. And we now see that the United States is threatening Iran directly, which I find to be something, an attack on Iran, I find to be unlikely, simply because that would be the end of the U.S. empire. It would be the end of the U.S. economy. It would be the end of Trump's presidency. It would bring down the U.S. economy. It would bring down the global economy. But attacking Iran, I mean, when the United States, after a year and a half, has failed to defeat Yemen, how in the world are they going to deal with Iran? If push comes to shove, Iran will hit back as hard as it can. And that will be the end of these Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region. If there's war in the Persian Gulf, none of these tiny regimes will last more than a couple of weeks. The war between Iran and the United States would lead to their downfall. I mean, it's inevitable. American bases are on their territory, and of course they'd be complicit if the Americans strike Iran because they have bases. They are, by the way, already complicit. The Americans, when the Israelis struck Iran, the Americans were assisting the Israelis through all of their bases in the region, from Turkey to Bahrain and the Emirates, and of course CENTCOM, its fourth headquarters is in Doha, is in Qatar, near Doha. And when Iran would reply to the Israeli regime, all of those radar bases were used to help the Israeli regime and the Americans defend the regime. So all of these, they are complicit already, but Iran tolerates it. Iran wants peace and stability in the region. It wants a calm region. It wants better relations. But the fact is that if these regimes allow the Americans, if the Americans carry out a strike on Iran, the Iranians will retaliate in the Persian Gulf region. And these are all glass mansions. These are all glass palaces. They will be shattered. And that will be the end of the oil and gas exports. That will be the end of all the tankers in the region. That will be the end of trade and business in the Persian Gulf region and probably beyond the Persian Gulf region. It could go all the way to the Caucasus. And that would bring down the global economy, but the Western economy in particular. And of course, the Americans would give enormous casualties. It's not something that Iran wants. It's not something that Iran pursues. But Iran has prepared itself for that consequence. Just as Yemen is undeterred. Yemen today is undeterred. The Americans can try to intimidate it, but Yemen will strike back. And it has been striking back. If the Americans strike Iran, then the Americans will pay the price. And the leader just a few days ago said that if the Americans strike, Iran will strike back decisively. And he said the Americans will be hurt more than the Iranians. He was very specific in saying that in such an exchange, the Americans will be on the losing end.
What was the main point of that letter that Trump sent to Iran? And what was he asking for? It was all about resistance, something beyond that? What do we know about that?
Well, I don't know the contents of the letter, obviously. I haven't seen it. I'm not privy to that sort of thing. But it seems that Trump is trying to gain concessions from Iran, and he wants Iran to give up its peaceful nuclear program, as well as its support for the resistance. Again, this is something that everyone has to remember. Without Iran, there would be no resistance. Hamas would not have the capabilities that it has. Islamic Jihad wouldn't either. Ansarullah wouldn't either. Hezbollah wouldn't either. Now, the United States and Erdogan and Netanyahu did a deal together to undermine Syria and to weaken at least one part of the resistance. And we've already discussed this before. Since 2011, the objective was to bring down Syria. And the Israelis wanted that, the Americans wanted that. Everything that's done in this region is done by first taking into account the interests of the Israeli regime. So what happened from 2011 was done for the sake of the Israeli regime, and the Israeli regime supported it. And unfortunately, Arab dictatorships, which have very little legitimacy, they're all family dictatorships or military dictatorships. They use sectarianism, racial hatred to otherize the resistance and to focus people towards the resistance rather than towards their own uh, shortcomings and their own betrayals. And I think the same is true in uh, among people within the Erdogan regime. So they use sectarianism to mobilize public opinion in the region, and the West use its media to mobilize public opinion across the world against Syria and against the resistance. But now everything is coming out. I mean, except for those who are narrow-minded sectarian people who, or people who are just in the camp of the political elite of the West. And it's interesting that these two overlap so much. Some of these people who are opposed to the West in Palestine, they support the West when it comes to Syria, uh, which is extraordinary. But except for these two groups, people's eyes have been opened. We now know why even in the Tulsi Gabbard said in the Senate that the Americans brought Al Qaeda to power in Syria. That Al Qaeda, she spoke of the false flag operations, the chemical attacks in Syria that were basically carried out by Al Qaeda, but attributed to the former president of Syria. All of these are coming out. Now you see public opinion across the globe sees Syria and what the West has done in Syria and beyond in a very different light. So while the West has succeeded in Syria in weakening the resistance, and I think that this is something that Trump is calculating mistakenly. While that is the case, but I think at another level, actually what happened in Syria, I think works to the. I mean, we're putting aside the fact that Al Qaeda and Jolani and his backers are slaughtering innocent people and carrying out their own genocide. And we see some of how Jolani's supporters in the West are now justifying genocide, and how the EU has been trying to blame the victims, and how some of these deeply sectarian people have been justifying the genocide. But that aside, the resistance has been vindicated. Hezbollah and Ansarullah were the ones making sacrifices for Gaza, which is Sunni, predominantly, almost exclusively, and the Al Qaeda and ISIS people who've come to power in Syria have done nothing, and they've allowed the Israeli regime to take so much territory. So Hezbollah has been vindicated. So in a sense, I know some people will say, well, morality counts for nothing. I don't agree with that. Hezbollah's stature has been enhanced dramatically because I think they and Ansarullah are the main protagonists in all this. They are the ones who sacrificed for another people, and they were stabbed in the back. And now the Al-Qaeda people and the ISIS people in Syria have shown themselves not to be interested in doing anything for the Palestinian people, and not even being interested in doing anything to take back their own territory. Instead, they go after minorities and slaughter Alawites and Christians and others. That, I think, that moral vindication in the eyes of the public, I think is something that cannot be calculated. And also, I don't think that, and I think this is going to be a burden for the Western camp. Syria is not going well. It is a black hole now. The economic situation is horrific. There's no security, and the regime has brought shame to Erdogan and to Al Jazeera and the rulers in Doha who support it. So it's not exactly as if the axis of resistance is weakened. I don't agree with that. I don't believe that the axis of resistance is weakened overall. Yes, in many ways it has been weakened, but so has the other side. In Syria, the opponents of the axis of resistance, I think, have been weakened because of how things have played out. In Palestine itself, the Israeli regime has been weakened. It has been delegitimized in the eyes of the world, just like what we're seeing in Damascus. Now they're delegitimizing themselves through genocide. Netanyahu and the Israeli regime are delegitimizing themselves in the eyes of the world. And that is bringing greater consensus. That is bringing people across the region and beyond closer to each other to support this one cause, and that is the liberation of the Palestinian people. And to weaken the forces of sectarianism and racism and those who seek to divide. Now, someone may say, what use is this? No. But the objective to bring an end to ethno-supremacism in Palestine, this has been going on. The idea to bring an end to this ethno-supremacist regime has been going on for decades. It has existed for decades. It is not going to have success overnight. We have to look in the long term. We have to look down the road 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, 5 years ahead. What's happening in the region is not to the benefit of the United States. Sectarianism is losing. The sectarianists, the genocidal forces that are supported by NATO and the regional allies, they're being discredited. The apartheid regime, the genocidal regime in Tel Aviv, discredited. People all across the region are seeing how their regimes have done nothing for the Palestinian people. And they see that the only people who are supporting the Palestinians are the resistance. They're seeing that Yemen is supporting the resistance, and even those who pretend to support the resistance in Palestine, they facilitate the bombing of Yemen. So this, I think, is creating an awareness that is very important, just like the awakening that we see in the West, how young people are turning against the Israeli regime. In polls that are carried out in the United States, they admit, and I'm sure the polls are not anti-Israelis, but even those polls that are being carried out by the United States now show that a minority of Americans support the Israeli regime. So when it's like that in the United States, imagine how it is across the world. None of this is good for the regime, and none of this is good for the United States. And then you have the broader picture where the West is on the decline. The West is at war in Ukraine. It is deeply divided. It is carrying out genocide in our region. It is exposing itself for being barbaric, brutal, and backwards. Meanwhile, the global South continues to grow. The West declines, and its rivals rise. This is something that, as we move forward, is going to bring about more change. The situation today, the weakness that we see today in the West, is a result of what the changes that were taking place over the past few years. And I think the endless wars carried out by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, the dirty war in Syria and Libya and elsewhere, all that weakened the United States. But I think the dirty war in Ukraine, or the proxy war in Ukraine, was probably even more effective, was definitely more effective in weakening the West even faster. So if instead of looking at tomorrow, we look at next year and 2 years from now and 3, 4, 5 years from now, I think the trend is not not good for the West. These are not good signs for the Israeli regime, and it's not a good sign for those regimes in the region that have been complicit.
We had a meeting between Iran and Russia and China talking about the Iranian nuclear program. What was that? What was the main objective of that meeting? Is Iran talking with its allies in order to prepare to confront Donald Trump and his administration?
Yes, the relationship between Iran, Russia, and China has improved significantly, especially since the war in Ukraine. And of course, Iran did the morally right thing, because when you look at things on the whole, it was NATO that brought about the war in Ukraine. They carried out the coup, they expanded NATO, despite promising to do others. The West keeps no promises. And that's something that the Iranians have also learned the hard way. But it also sees what's going on elsewhere. They exited nuclear arms deals, missile deals with Russia. They've expanded NATO. They carried out a coup in Ukraine, and they wanted, by the way, as they wanted to bring in to use Ukraine against Russia, they also were talking about expanding NATO and including Georgia. That's a security threat to Iran. So Iran did the right thing, but also Iran did the smart thing. It's assisted Russia in its war. And that has brought the relationship even closer. Imagine if the liberal elites in Iran, who've always been pro-Western. Well, actually, they weren't pro-Western. They were the so-called hardliners in the 1980s and the 1990s, and they flipped. They were the people who basically took over the U.S. Embassy. Of course, the U.S. Embassy was taken because the United States gave refuge to the Shah after he had killed thousands of people in Iran and after doing what he did to the Iranian people through a secret police and so on. And the Iranians were fearful that the Americans would carry out another coup, and that resulted in the takeover. So the embassy takeover was not the beginning of the problems between Iran and the United States. It was a result of what the United States had. It was a reaction to what the United States had done to Iranians. But American historians and history books and politicians, they pretend as if history began with the embassy takeover, the history of relations between the two sides. But if these liberal elites had their way, if the government had listened to them and we had sided with the West, which I think would have been immoral, then the relationship between Russia and Iran today would be much weaker, and so would the relationship with China. And do you think that if Iran had taken a different path, that Trump would behave differently towards Iran today? Of course not. He would still move to intimidate Iran. He will still move to attack Iran's allies. He will still move to weaken Iran as much as possible. Trump is not someone who anyone can trust. The United States cannot be trusted by anyone. Ask Canada. Ask Panama. Ask his European allies. No one can trust the United States. So Iran's position, which was morally justified in the Ukrainian war, although Iran was against war and is against war, everyone is against, most people are against war, it was morally justified, but also it was a very smart move. And today, the relationship between Iran, Russia, and China is much stronger than before. So that makes it all the more difficult for the United States, even though Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not all of them combined. If you put all of them together and add Vietnam, you still won't have Iran. Iran has established a balance of terror with the United States. The Persian Gulf produces much, and the region produces much of the oil and gas that is needed across the globe. And the United States has in large numbers of bases here. And the Iranians have created a missile capability and drone capability that can destroy everything. And that would bring down the US economy. So while Iran does not want war, that balance of terror has been established. And therefore, Iran, without Russia and China, can deter the United States from making stupid moves. I mean, it's not impossible that the United States would attack Iran, but the implications for Trump, the man of peace, would be the peacemaker, Trump the peacemaker, as he tried to frame himself, would be absolutely horrific.
Hamas just put out a statement says that the United States is responsible for what's going on right now between Gaza and between Palestinians and Israel. And they ask the Arab Islamic nation to unite and help them on the street. How do you see the way that the United States is playing the role in this, uh, the way that Israel is attacking again Gaza? Is that a plan on the part of the US government that was all along since January 20th? We had the ceasefire. Do you think that the Trump administration had it in its mind because of the hostages, because of all of that, and they want to exchange that, then again go and fire, then and bomb Gazans? And or it's net near it's the situation in Israel, the domestic policy of Israel, which forced Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is trying to somehow solve his problems and attacking it. That's why he put pressure on the Trump administration to help them to at least accept them letting them attacking Gazans.
I'm quite sure that from the very beginning, the Americans were not sincere about the ceasefire. And of course, the Israelis weren't either. And that's why back then I said that I don't think the ceasefire will last. It's just a matter of time. I don't think they had any special calendar. They had a calendar in front of them and they were saying that, okay, now is the time to do this back then. They in like 2-3 months later, they'll do this. I don't think that was. I don't think they're that good at planning. Actually, I don't think they're good at planning at all. But I think they did. Their intention was not to ever allow Gaza to be rebuilt, for the people in Gaza to have peace. I don't think that was ever the intention for a moment, whether in Washington or in European capitals or in Palestine, meaning the Israeli regime. That was never the intention. So the continuation of the genocide was inevitable. But the restarting the genocide, and some of your viewers may disagree with me, but I think this is a very valid point to make. The restarting of the genocide looks much more ugly for the Israeli regime now than than when it was carrying out the genocide a few months ago, because we were witnessing it every day. And even though many of us were trying to make sure that people saw what was happening, and we kept reminding many people across the world, activists, they've been heroic everywhere. But because Western media has been trying to downplay it, because they're part of the genocide. The BBC, they're foot soldiers in this genocide. CNN, Fox News, the French media, German media, they're a part of this genocide. They're all complicit. They are more than complicit. They're partners in genocide. But for activists at the grassroots, and of course others who have more influence, they've been working hard to create greater awareness and keep people focused on the genocide. But when it's happening 24 hours a day, day and night, it becomes somewhat normalized, sadly. But now that it's stopped, people across the world have been breathing a sigh of relief that at least fewer people are dying. And of course, the West has been hiding the fact that they still are killing people, they're imposing starvation. That is true. But across the world, there's been people have been breathing, people are happy that at least the slaughter has decreased dramatically. With this revives all that anger again. It is, the images that we've been seeing over the past few hours are they're shocking, and it revives all the memories of the past year and a half. So this is not good for the Israeli regime. It's not good for the Trump regime. It's not good for these European regimes. And it's also not good for these Arab regimes. Some may say, Hamas's statement is foolish. It's useless. The Arab regimes are not going to do anything. Turkey is not going to do anything. And they're right. But Hamas is not being foolish, nor is Islamic Jihad. These statements put more pressure on these regimes. It reminds people that their governments are doing nothing. And someone will say, well, nothing will happen. Perhaps. But I think ultimately something will. And we saw, how vulnerable all these regimes were during the so-called Arab Spring or the awakening a decade and a half ago. We saw how vulnerable they are. Today, they're much more vulnerable. And the forces that are supporting them in the West are much weaker. And the anger on the streets is much greater. So I think that this vulnerability is something that the Americans need to take into consideration. And the same is true with the Israeli regime. And I think, by the way, what happened in Syria is while it's a victory for Netanyahu and the United States, or at least for Biden, and Erdogan, but it is a threat as well, because these terror groups, they are not, they can inspire other groups in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt and elsewhere. This is a double-edged sword, using these terrorist groups, especially when you are on the decline, especially when you're fighting against so many different enemies across the world, from New Zealand to China, from Canada to Russia, and from Panama to the axis of resistance. It becomes more difficult for the United States to manage its allies in the region. So I do think that the restarting of this genocide is pushing us one step closer to how should I put it? One step closer to the demise of the Zionist regime.
Yeah. But when you look at the way that the Trump administration is sending the letter, just restarting the war in Gaza, attacking Yemen, we're getting back to the same point that we've been talking about during the Biden administration, the same sort of attitude. How do you see the way that he's trying to put pressure on Iran, and in order to convince them to negotiate with him on the terms it seems that he wants to be on the table?
Well, by carrying out slaughter in Gaza, and by the Americans carrying out airstrikes in Yemen, they want to intimidate Iran. The whole point is for Iran to back down. If Iran is removed from the equation, then I think the Palestinian cause would come to an end. I hate to say that, but without Iran, it's over. And because no one else is interested in the Palestinian cause. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. Qatar, Al Jazeera is not, Qatar is allowed to have Al Jazeera because the Americans allow it. If the Americans decide that Al Jazeera should be shut down, it will be shut down. It's not as if Qatar is on the side of the resistance. There are complicated calculations across the region. Just like in Iraq. Iraq is caught between Iran and the United States. So the Iraqi government does some things for the Americans, because Iraqi oil has to go through American banks. It's not an independent country. The sanctions imposed during Saddam Hussein, they still have an impact on the way in which the government functions. So the Americans can hold back the money whenever they want. And so Iraq, on the one hand, they want good relations with Iran. On the other hand, the Americans want them not to have any relations with Iran. So there's always this friction. And it's the same is true across the region. So the Americans can put some pressure here. They allow something to happen there. But Qatar is not going to do anything for the Palestinian people. They allowed their airspace to be used, their territory to be used to hit Yemen. If genocide is horrible, then why is it okay in Yemen? If genocide is horrible, of course, why is it okay in Syria? But what the point is that none of these Arab regimes or Erdogan, none of them are going to do anything about Palestine. Without Iran, the Palestinian cause is over, at least in our lifetime. But I'm confident. I'm confident about the axis of resistance. Of course, without the resistance of the Palestinian people, it would be over. I mean, that's true as well. The resilience of the people of Gaza, the resilience of the people in Lebanon, the resilience of people in Yemen, and many in Iraq. All of these are necessary for the cause and for the resistance to exist and for the hope to continue to exist for the Palestinian people. So they're all necessary. But of course, the Americans are targeting Iran because they see that Iran is not controlling any of these groups. Again, this is something that we were discussing at the beginning. Ansarullah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Remember, when Hamas, Islamic Jihad, this is not true for it, but it's not true about Islamic Jihad. But when the political wing of Hamas made the unwise decision of supporting the terrorists in Syria a decade ago, and they fell into, this was an American project. The politicians, those people should have known better. The Israelis were behind it, the Americans were behind it, NATO was behind it. Obviously, it was not good for Palestine. But when people, not everyone in the political wing, and some to lesser degrees and some to, when they fell into the American trap and supported the regime change, the dirty war, the regime change project in Syria, and the dirty war in Syria, did that change Iran's policy towards the resistance? No. Iran continued to support the resistance in Gaza. What this extensive defense capability that was created in Gaza and in the West Bank, this took decades. During that period when the political wing was making wrong decisions, Iran continued to support Hamas. Even though some people were angry and saying, why are you supporting them when they're supporting these ISIS and Al-Qaeda people? And of course, some of the people in the political wing, they later realized the mistake that they made. And some, as I said from the beginning, they weren't influenced. Some were significantly influenced. But the relationship with Hamas today is excellent. And the reason is that Iran has patience, because what is important for Iran is the cause itself. The Palestinian people deserve liberation. Apartheid in Palestine is immoral, whether in the West Bank or Gaza or within the 1967 borders. It's immoral and illegitimate. And Iran will continue to take that position. And this is also something that we should note. While Iran is under pressure, while the United States and the West are antagonizing Iran, but one thing has changed, and that is that the world, the narrative of Iran, where Iran was the enemy, Iran was evil, and this narrative was repeated by Arab regimes through their media and continues to be promoted by these regimes, whether in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. And the Western media across the world has been antagonistic towards Iran and the regime for over decades. But we see people across the world now seeing reality. We see people, I see this through my engagements, online engagements, in my discussions with you, with others. My people contact me from across the world, or people who I meet. You see the mood has changed towards the resistance in Iran dramatically. So for over 40 years, Iran was demonized and antagonized. Now people are waking up to reality. Those who lied about Iran and tried to undermine Iran through regime change operations and propaganda. Now they see the reality that those who are against human rights and women's rights and children's rights are the ones who are slaughtering Palestinians, who've been slaughtering the people of Lebanon, who've been slaughtering the people in Yemen, and who impose ISIS and Al Qaeda on Syria and have destroyed Syria.
Just to wrap up this session, Professor Marandi, do you think that the way that Trump is trying to escalate the situation between the United States and Ansarullah and Yemenis, do you think that that would bring Ansarullah to a point to attack American bases in the Arab states?
I don't know what Ansarullah will do, but I think that Ansarullah will continue to fire at U.S. ships. It will block the Red Sea to American ships now, as well as Israeli ships and probably British ships, thus causing significant damage to the U.S. economy. And the global economy will be damaged because of what the United States is doing. But the United States is creating this tension. This is going to hurt the U.S. economy more than anyone else, but it's going to hurt the global economy, which also hurts the U.S. economy indirectly. But they will continue to. And remember, the Americans are paying the heavy price. By firing these missiles and drones, the Ansarullah forces the American ships and aircraft carrier to go to the north of the Red Sea. Every time they try to strike, they have to fly all the way down. That is very costly. Having those having aircraft carriers and all these ships in the region are very costly for the United States. And then Ansarullah fires cheap drones, inexpensive drones, highly sophisticated drones, but still very cheap. And then they also fire drones that are less sophisticated, but also very cheap. And the Americans shoot them down with very expensive missiles. So they're bleeding the Americans. And then the Americans constantly bomb Yemen. They hurt their image further, but to no avail, because they're not striking anything that is strategic. Everything that is strategic is very deep underground, more so than in Lebanon and in Gaza, because Yemen is so much bigger, and they've been fighting this war for 10 years. And unlike Hezbollah in Lebanon, where they are surrounded by, they don't control the country. So there's the 40 or so Western embassies, and then the embassies linked to the West. All of them are facilitating espionage and the NGOs against Hezbollah. That's not the case in Yemen. The Yemeni government has authority over most of the land. It's huge, huge population, very sophisticated people, very principled people. The Americans have chosen the wrong enemy. They will not win. And as this goes on, American allies in the region are going to be seen in a more negative light, and they'll be seen increasingly as complicit, and people will admire Ansarullah more than before. This is not a war that the Americans can win. In fact, this is a war that the Americans have already lost. But of course, many, many innocent people will die, but that's okay for the West. They don't care. Western media doesn't care. They do their best to hide it, as they're doing in the West Bank, as they've been doing in Gaza, as they've been doing in Lebanon. As I said earlier on, every day they've been killing, on average, at least one person has been killed in Lebanon over the past 3 months. Have the guarantors done anything about it? Has Western media been saying anything about it? On average, over 3 people, before the massacre this morning, over 3 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed. And then we're now seeing, of course, the ethnic cleansing taking place in the West Bank at a much greater pace than before. Do people hear about this in the West? Is the Western media covering any of this? Of course not, because they are arms. These are, the Western media is an arm of Western aggression and the Western Empire.
Just to wrap up this session, do you think that the way that Hamas is asking the Muslim countries to unite to help them, Do you think that would bring some sort of sanity among the Muslim countries to understand the situation in Gaza, maybe helping them? Is that, are we getting to that moment, or we are far away from that moment happening?
It doesn't have any impact. I mean, it's not going to change the stance of the leaders. Erdogan will continue transporting oil. Aliyev will continue to do business as usual. Egypt will continue to receive products through the Red Sea, and then put them on other ships and send them to Israel. Jordan will continue to do business as usual, and so on. They're not going to change. But as I said earlier, this is going to put more pressure on these regimes because public opinion is important, and the pressure is building. And at some point, it's like boiling water. When you don't see any movement, but when it begins to boil, then suddenly things change. The water looks calm, but when it reaches boiling point, then it changes. So we may it could be the calm before the storm. This will bring about change ultimately, but the question is when. So Hamas, its statement, and the statements made by Islamic Jihad, and the statements made by Hezbollah and Ansarullah and all those in the resistance, they have an impact. It may not change government policy in Jordan or Egypt or Turkey or Turkey, but it puts more pressure on the leaders who are collaborating with the Israeli regime.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Great being on your show. Thank you for having me.